Hello, we're here today to keep talking about art history. We're going to talk about new period today. We've been talking about artists from the Renaissance, particularly last weekend with the High Renaissance, talking about Michelangelo and Raphael. We're zooming ahead now to around the year 1600. So, in the space between the High Renaissance masters, who painted till around 1550, to the beginning of the what we call the Baroque period, 1600. There are some changes in the church. We said last time that the Catholic Church split. The Protestant Reformation happened towards the end of Michelangelo's career when he was painting The Last Judgment, and the church, who still wields an enormous amount of power and influence over Europe and certainly over art as a result, culture at large, now has some pretty different attitudes. And as a result of the Protestant Reformation and some reforms that were designed to kind of scale back the church and say, maybe we were a little decadent, maybe we were a little over the top, now the Catholic Church is not trying to win back the Protestants anymore, not trying to keep that control, and they have a new attitude. And that attitude is, we are going to assault your senses with art, basically, is what the Baroque means. So when we see works of art today in the Baroque period, you're going to see the ideas of art kind of pushed about as far as they possibly can. Some Baroque art can feel a little gaudy or a little over the top, but I would also argue that it's some of the most impressive art that has ever been made. And the two artists we're going to talk about today will blow your mind if you look deeply at what they've created. So we're talking today about two Baroque masters, both Italians, both working in Rome for the most part. And the first is Bernini, who you see on the left here with Bernini and his sculpture David. And then the other is Caravaggio, who you see on the right. Caravaggio, The Calling of St. Matthew. Here we go. So Bernini. Bernini is strictly a sculptor. He's the greatest of the Baroque sculptors. He did do some architecture as well, but for the most part, sculpture is his main thing. He's a sculpture prodigy from the time he's a small kid, trained to be a sculptor, and actually worked for 6 decades for the Catholic Church, creating works of art. Statues everywhere, all around Rome, fountains, and of course bridges and buildings and architecture as well. They all have the fingerprints of Bernini on them. So this is one of his major works here, done when he was a young man. And this is Bernini's David. So this is the David of David and Goliath again. We've looked at some other Davids. Remember, we looked at Donatello's David, the awkward kind of realistic nude, the first standing nude sculpture since ancient times. We looked at Michelangelo's David last week. His David, incredibly naked, but also incredibly confident and just standing there, with no shame whatsoever. And now we have Bernini's David, and you can see the influence of Baroque culture and Baroque thinking on this sculpture here, because his David isn't standing still. His David is actually coiled like a spring. And that's the best way to think about Baroque sculpture, is that it's high action sculpture. It's the kind of thing that a human being really should not be able to do with a hammer and a chisel and a piece of stone. They shouldn't be able to make what feels like a frozen black and white photograph. But that's effectively what Bernini can do. That's how amazing he is at sculpting the body and replicating space. Also, statues normally stand erect, straight up and down, because that's a much easier thing to carve. It's incredibly difficult to have something, for example, like his David, which is leaning way to one side here. That's hundreds of pounds of marble, and the whole thing can just topple over. So it's quite an engineering challenge to figure out how to make statues stand up when you're trying to do something like this. So the difference with his David's preparing to throw the sling at Goliath, right? He's staring down the giant. If you look at him, he's biting his lip. His hair blows in the wind. His muscles are taut. His abdomen is curled like a spring. Here's another view from the other side. He's getting prepared to throw that rock directly at the giant. He's full concentration as well. Absolutely a remarkable sculpture in its realism, and it's a super strange one to stand in front of, because it tends to feel just very alive. Notice how the middle underneath David's feet there he had to have a huge piece of rock there in order to balance out the whole thing. So if you remember from the story of David and Goliath, King Saul offers David his armor when David says he'll go fight the giant, and he tries it on and says, this is too, I can't even move in this, right? And he throws it aside. So you can see a breastplate there on the ground. Fascinating sculpture, and remember, high action sculpture. He's even carved the little bits of twine in the rope, wrapped around the sling here. Feels like it could move at any moment. This is a cardinal. His name was Scipione Borghese, and Borghese was his main client. Basically worked for the Vatican and realized the genius of Bernini and paid to have much of his work made. And today, if you go to Rome, there's a huge garden called the Borghese Gardens and a gallery where you can see the David and his other earlier sculptures. We'll go quick through some of these. Here's his Medusa. Again, talk about a tricky thing to try to carve here, right? Medusa with her hair becoming these snakes that can turn into stone if you look at them. Let's break down a few others. So among the David, and today if you go to the Borghese Museum, you can see the David and you can see this sculpture, and then the next one we'll talk about. And they are fascinating works of art because they just are so rich and so deep. Bernini's pioneering this idea that a work of art like a sculpture, which is something that of course just stands still, can actually unfold itself and tell a story. So if you look at the base of this sculpture here, there are 4 sides, and depending on which side you're standing on, you're going to see a different side of the story. The name of this piece is The Rape of Persephone. Rape not as in sexual rape, it's a very strong negative word, but rape as in kidnapping is what it means. And this is a mythological piece. So the story summed up by me would be Hades, okay, god of the underworld, has the hots for Persephone, and he comes and he kidnaps her and brings her back to the underworld. So here we see Hades, this enormous classical nude, incredibly strong, incredibly realistic. Look at his knee, for example, or the blood veins or vessels you can see beneath the skin, the muscles of his abs there. So from one side, we see him walking up out of the underworld from the backside, obviously. And then from this angle, we see the struggle, right? He's grabbed her, and she's fighting back. She kind of yells in anger. She pushes violently at his head as he grabs her. From the other side, we can't see his face as much, and we see her face, and her face actually turns from one of anger to the other side, and it actually, you can see this tear coming out of her eye, almost like, from this side, she's realized there's no use fighting it. There's nothing she can do. She's going to be taken. She's going to be kidnapped. This one of the most incredible slides from all of art. That is not a black and white photograph. That is a sculpture right there, carved by Bernini only in his young 20s there. And just look at that hand, how realistic it is, how when it touches the edge of her flesh there, how it actually indents it, and the light. It just makes it look totally soft. And, that's a hardened piece of marble. Absolutely miraculous. If we go around to the other side, we don't see either of their faces. We see that they're being, that they're going back down to the underworld. And the large piece that is in between Hades' legs here in order to balance out the whole piece and keep it from tipping over is one of these 3-headed dogs, Cerberus, I believe they're called, right? I can't remember. Cerberus. They're the guardians of the underworld. So again, the idea that a sculpture can unfold itself and tell a story is a totally new, crazy way of thinking about sculpture, and just a ridiculously complex work for Bernini to pull off. Finally, the third of his pieces that he made, in his 20s, very much his kind of most amazing pieces is this one. This is called Apollo and Daphne, another mythological scene here. The short version of the myth is Apollo has the hots for Daphne. Daphne, not so much. She asks her father to cast a spell to turn her into a tree should she ever be captured or try to be taken by Apollo. So Apollo chases her through the woods and reaches out, and as he touches her, she sprouts leaves and starts turning into a tree. What a crazy subject to try to carve or figure out how to show in a sculpture of all things. So from the backside of this, you can imagine, you see the two of them playfully running through the woods, and it appears that Apollo is chasing her. He reaches out and grabs her around her belly there, and if you look at her feet are starting to sprout roots and her legs are starting to turn into a tree trunk as she flails her arms up and kind of yells. And then from the opposite side here, you can see that she starts to sprout leaves and become a tree, and she's actually become a full trunk of a tree from this side. So from the other side, you can't even see Daphne. All you see is Apollo reaching around the side of a tree. Again, crazy sculpture. He has to carve this huge spiral billowing piece of cloth around Apollo to keep the whole thing from tipping over. Just a miraculous achievement to be able to carve something like this. Bernini's main place of work is this place. This is St. Peter's Basilica. We've talked about it a little bit, but I like this slide because you can kind of see it. It's a place you should go and visit. It's one of the fascinating places on the planet to visit in terms of the sheer amount of cultural and artistic heritage in this one spot. Center of the Roman Catholic Church. It's an enormous building. If you look really closely there at how big the church is compared to people down there on the ground, there's little tiny dots. Those would be the people. I mean, you could fly a full-size airplane through the center of the building. You can see Michelangelo's dome, that enormous dome that he designed before he passed away. You can actually see the Sistine Chapel here. If you look just to go to the front face of the building and then follow it to the right, and eventually you'll see a little triangle, rectangle with a triangle top right there, and that is the Sistine Chapel. You can also see, if you keep going further right of that, a little square. That's the Raphael rooms. So the ones we talked about last time. Bernini carved this whole plaza out in the front, which is called the Piazza San Pietro, Plaza of St. Peter. It's these kind of half circle shapes with these long extensions coming out from the church. It's made to look like two arms, basically, kind of welcoming in believers right into the church. Look really close. There are statues. There's actually 140 of them, all carved by Bernini in his workshop. They go on the top of the church all the way around what's called that colonnade, or that big shape that welcomes people in. Here's what it looks like from down below. There's 140 of them. They're all 18 to 20 feet tall. Figures from the Bible, saints from the church. Anyway, the overall effect of seeing him and being surrounded by him is you're just kind of numb to the sheer amount of amazing art around you. And that's very much the idea of the Baroque, right? To push things over the top in terms of their extravagance and their elegance. Inside the church, there are other things that are not designed by Bernini as well. So the church is the shape of a cross, and directly in the center, right beneath the dome, is this. This is called the baldacchino. It's a solid piece of cast bronze that looks like this canopy. There's a globe on the top, and that's, the idea being that, from the dome straight down, this is, the Pope will sit here for high mass, that sort of thing. If you need a sense of how big this is, look at the very bottom of the piece, slightly to the right of center, and you can see a monk there. So it's 60 feet high, a piece of carved bronze by Bernini. And then at the very end of the church, we have what's called, at the top of the cross, what's called the papal seat. And that's this piece, which is, you can see a chair down there. Don't be mistaken, that is a very, very oversized chair. Just for reference, we have angels kind of spilling out of heavens and a glimpse of the heavens here. We have the Holy Spirit and the dove in this stained glass window. That dove, there it is, is 6 feet wide. The dove is 6 feet wide. So, take a full-size person, lay them down, and that's how big that is. So you can see how big the chair is there. Anyway, designed so that it really looks like the heavens are spilling over and out into the church, all carved in bronze or cast in bronze by Bernini in his workshop. So extravagant that you kind of have a difficult time focusing on certain parts of the piece. His work's everywhere in the church. Here's another piece. We won't have time for this, but they're just everywhere you look. There are incredible statues and works of art. Another famous work of his here, the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, quite controversial in its time, but again, he spent 6 decades working for the church and had many assistants to help him, but there are just hundreds and hundreds of statues all over the place in little tiny churches around Rome, all bearing the signature of Bernini and his workshop. Finally, there is a famous plaza or piazza in Rome called Piazza Navona, not far from the Vatican, in the center of old Rome. And there's a huge fountain in the middle of this where from Roman times, Roman aqueducts, which brought water into the city, many of them still function through underground tunnels that are still there, and water still flows down hundreds of miles from the hills into the city and still spills out so that people can have fresh water. It's a Roman invention, and they still work today. But Bernini designed some of these fountains as well, which you can go and see today. So this one's called the Fountain of the Four Rivers, and it's this fountain with these huge, just massive figures, each one personifying the four largest known rivers in the world at the time. So you have the Ganges River in India, the Nile River in Africa, you have the Danube River in Europe, and then the Platte River in the New World. Remember, this is 1600, so the New World has been discovered. The Platte is in South America. They actually had not, they thought that was the longest river. They didn't even know the Amazon was a river because the mouth of it is so enormous that they thought it was an enormous inlet and not even a river. So anyway, it just chronicles from the time what people knew. And around these huge, enormous figures, which represent the largest rivers on earth, are known to people in the 1600s. You have animals and trees and natural forms, and all twisting and turning. Notice how none of Bernini's sculptures ever are sitting just still and perfectly posed, right? They're always twisting, arms flailing, legs out, high action, motion, movement in sculpture. Just endlessly interesting, fascinating to look at, and ridiculously complex in the fact that they're made. So anyway, when you go to Rome today, which you should at some point, it's truly one of the most amazing cities to visit. Just everywhere you look, you'll see Bernini, and just a fascinating artist. Okay, let's move on. Here's Caravaggio. Caravaggio, Caravaggio. Caravaggio. His full name was actually Michelangelo Merisi, but he was from the village of Caravaggio. And because there was another famous Michelangelo, that would be Michelangelo Buonarroti, the Michelangelo we talked about last week, he over time has become known as Caravaggio, just to not have two Michelangelos. But there you go. And this piece is called The Calling of St. Matthew. The Calling of St. Matthew. So definitely a different dynamic between Bernini and Caravaggio. Bernini works for the church his entire career. Caravaggio, one of the most fascinating biographies that I can think of, not just in art, but period, because self-destructive in every way, definitely the equivalent of a modern-day rock star who's just lets all of their success go to their head and just dabbles in excess and basically ends up dying young. For rock stars, that's often through drugs or self-destructive means. And for Caravaggio, he basically is a violent street thug at the same time as he is the most sought-after, in-demand painter. And that's why this is such a crazy story I'm about to tell you. Caravaggio revolutionized painting in enormous ways, which we'll talk about. And he also killed a man. He was a known murderer who at the end of his life went on a run and died under mysterious circumstances, perhaps at the hand of bounty hunters who were trying to, find him and kill him. So anyway, absolutely crazy story. Let's get into it. This is The Calling of St. Matthew, which is in a church in Rome. In fact, here's what it looks like. Everywhere in Rome, when you walk around, it's not just St. Peter's, but there are just little chapels everywhere. And you go in, and it's one of the more fun things to do in Rome. You just walk around, and if you see an open door, you go in, because they stay open throughout the day for people to come in and pray. And you can just wander in, and oftentimes you can see works of art like Caravaggio's hanging in their original spot, where many other pieces of art, long ago would have been taken away and put in a museum. A lot of his are still in the original spot. So here you go. It's it's actually a canvas. It's not painted on the wall. And it's hanging in this little side nave here, along with two other paintings by Caravaggio that describe the life of St. Matthew. St. Matthew starts as Levi the tax collector. And so if we look at this piece here, we see some people sitting around a table. They're dressed very much like Baroque era Roman people. Remember, art mirrors culture, and so he's very much updated the scene. And they're all sitting at a table here. One of them has his head down and he's counting coins. Okay, so you can see he's counting his money there. And then off to the right, you can see Jesus. Okay, he's got a tiniest bit of a halo around his head, and he points his arm out, basically saying, "Him, I want him." There's a gray-haired man with his back to us. That is Peter, and he's basically directing Peter, "Go get him." Everybody else at the table seems to notice these other gentlemen coming in the door and are pointing at themselves as if to say, "Are you talking to me? You want me?" And no, they want Levi the tax collector. And the story is, of course, that Jesus says, "Follow me," and Levi the tax collector, the lowest, most despised person because he takes people's money and takes extra for himself, leaves that life behind and changes his name to Matthew and follows Christ. So that's the subject. But above that, just look at the picture. Consider the Michelangelo pieces we looked at last week on the Sistine Chapel and elsewhere, or even the Raphael paintings. They're very bright. The background is lit. They're not ridiculously heavy into the shadows. And these are the exact opposite. The painting itself is mostly black. It's mostly dingy brown and black. In fact, with that window up above and paper shades, it's meant to look like the dingiest and kind of darkest of Roman dive bars is basically what it's meant to look like. And he uses the light in a very theatrical way. Think of actors on a stage. It's completely dark on the stage, and you turn on the spotlight from one side. So figures' faces are often, like Christ's face, for example, half in shadow, half in light. And he can use the light in order to tell you where to look in the piece, to draw your attention from one area to another, to make this really rich, dynamic, fascinating, and highly realistic type of painting that becomes Baroque painting. There's a name for this. You'll hear me say it again over the next couple of weeks. It's called chiaroscuro, and that's the Italian word for dark and light, okay? Chiaroscuro. And it's basically painting on a black canvas and then adding bits of light coming out of the darkness. Caravaggio, an exceedingly dark person. I mentioned that he killed a guy, but also he's kind of a street thug. And as is often the case with Caravaggio, the more you look, the more you kind of see dark, kind of twisted things of his own personality that tend to creep into the piece. This is going to be monumental for painting, and as we'll see next week and in the weeks after this, painting in this dark way with highlighted figures coming out of the shadows like you're looking at actors on a stage becomes the new norm for painting. So it's going to revolutionize painting, and it begins with Caravaggio in Rome in 1600. There he is in a sketch from a self-portrait here, Caravaggio. So we'll go through a few early pieces here and then get to some fascinating stories about him. Here's St. Francis. St. Francis has fainted out in nature here. He's actually been caught as he's fallen back by an angel who's prepared to kind of lay him back on the grass here. So, again, this is supposed to be a bright daytime scene, but look how dark it is. It looks like actors on a stage with a bright light beaming down over the top of them. Here's a very clever piece called Card Sharks. And you can see these two gentlemen here conspiring with each other to cheat this poor sap on the left out of his money. One of them indicates that he has a 2 in his hand, and the other has extra cards in his belt. But again, look at the light source, the light shining from off the side of the painting to the left across his face, casting this big bright yellow on the wall. It creates high contrast, so like areas of dark and light right next to each other. It's super interesting, beautifully painted, and highly realistic as well. In this case, for a funny subject. Now, in Rome, just like in Florence, and we talked about this the last 2 weeks with Leonardo, Botticelli, Raphael, Michelangelo, there's a lot of money being thrown to artists on behalf of wealthy people for churches. So if you have some money, the best way you can get in good standing with the neighborhood and also with God is to commission a beautiful painting and then donate it to the church. And so a lot of Caravaggio's paintings are biblical subjects. Here we have an old man. He's holding a young man down to a rock, preparing to kill him. There's a ram and an angel. So hopefully you can kind of recognize this scene. This is Abraham and Isaac, okay? And it's this very dark story, right, from the Old Testament. Abraham in his old age is promised a son, and that son is Isaac. And what happens? God asks him one day to take him up on the mount and sacrifice him, to kill him. And he tests Abraham. And Abraham, without saying anything, prepares to do it. At the last minute, an angel interferes and says, "Stop, don't hurt the boy." And the angel provides a ram for the sacrifice instead of the boy. So it's a dark story, the kind of dark story that someone like Caravaggio would have loved. Caravaggio came out of abject poverty and was basically living on the street, and that's where he grew up. And he lived in the back alley streets of Rome, not far from Piazza Navona, that huge fountain I showed you from Bernini today. That was his neighborhood. And these were basically just, they were roaming street gangs, right? That is what this is. This is dangerous time and a dangerous area. Just imagine people in madrigal dinner garb running around, sword dueling with each other, and organized crime, all of that. That's Caravaggio. And so when he paints something like the Abraham and Isaac, which you can see here, he's doing it because it's been commissioned. But also he's putting what he knows of violence and this kind of, dark confrontation between characters into a scene. It's a dark story, right? And if there's anyone who knows, the look of horror on a face when you hold somebody down and hold a knife up to their throat or to their face, it's Caravaggio, because we know for a fact that he was arrested for doing things like this. They still have police records going back hundreds and hundreds of years, and we know that Caravaggio was often thrown in jail overnight for bar brawls and for duels out on the street and for causing trouble. We know at one time that he got in a fight at a restaurant and insulted a guy by throwing artichokes at him. And I mean, there's very specific police records that show, these awful insults he hurled at people. And, it's crazy that it still exists. And it's there. So he was comfortable with this kind of violence. It was who he was and something he couldn't resist. And it's often the case with Caravaggio, when you know that about him and you look at a piece like this, it kind of turns your stomach a little bit and then adds an extra bit of power to the piece that is often not been there with other painters who don't have that background. Here's Caravaggio's Bacchus. Bacchus, the Roman god of wine and partying. He's often seen wearing a toga with this huge cornucopia hat and surrounded by bowls of fruit and, of course, a big goblet of wine. His Bacchus here, doesn't exactly look super thrilled. He seems kind of empty. His skin is the tiniest bit of a green color. The hidden thing here is if you look at that fruit at the bottom there, it's actually rotten. The apples are molded over. The peach is kind of cracked open and oozing. The grapes have turned brown. So what's he saying here? Bacchus here, the wine. He's the god of wine and partying, but he's probably in his own subtle way here saying, yeah, wine and partying, drunkenness. It's not all fun. It's maybe not all it's cracked up to be. So other pieces, all painted in a fairly short span here for churches in and around Rome. Here's the entombment. Just check out how dark the background is and the stark the lighting is. It really does look like actors on a stage with a spotlight here. The dead Christ being taken off the cross, placed into the tomb. Notice how he reaches down with his hand, even though he's dead, and barely touches the edge of the rock, almost as if to say, put me in here. Also, where does Caravaggio place the viewer? We are standing down in the ground. Our eye level is level with the man's feet there. So we're kind of down in the grave, being prepared to receive dead Christ here. Really powerful painting. Not all of his paintings were loved and appreciated. In fact, you get the sense when you look at his paintings that often he's trying to push the subject matter about as far as he can go before they're going to get rejected and sent back. So this is one of the ones that was not appreciated and was sent back. The name of the piece is The Conversion of Paul, or The Conversion of Saul, I guess. So, the story from Acts is that Saul is persecuting the Christians. He's on his way to Damascus. A bright light knocks him off his horse. He's blinded. and the bright light is a vision of Jesus, who says, "Why do you persecute me?" And he's blinded. And so here we see the man. He's fallen off his horse. He's laying on the ground there, flailing his arms. He has a scale over top of his eyes, so he cannot see. But what is really the dominant thing in the picture? It's the horse, right? More than that, it's kind of the horse's rear end is the big part of the piece. And just, I guess, to add some extra tension, the horse rears up its front hoof, almost like it's going to step on him on the ground here. And so it's a very strange painting. He's pushed in a different place. And this is the kind of painting that, he painted and painted extremely well, but because it was odd and it wasn't what the people wanted, they said, well, we're not paying for that. Another really powerful piece here, the crucifixion of Peter. According to Christian legend, Peter was killed in Rome under Emperor Nero. And when he was going to be crucified, he asked that they crucify him upside down. He didn't consider himself worthy to be crucified the same way as Christ, and so he was crucified upside down. So here we have the old man nailed to a cross. I mean, ridiculously realistic. Just look at the nail going through his feet there, how the feet are tensioned, and it really is like beautiful, perfect color photography of stage actors is kind of what it looks like. Just exquisitely painted here. And then everything about this is lifting it up. So we have three faceless executioners here, one hauling the rope, one lifting the cross, one pushing with his back, all raising it up. Just a really emotional, powerful gut punch of a painting here. And to reinforce that Caravaggio is not always easy to look at, here's a piece, his Doubting Thomas. So if you remember, Thomas, when the others are saying they've seen Jesus and he's alive, he's been resurrected, he says, "I will not believe until I can put my finger in his side and in his wound." Then Jesus appears and Thomas falls on the ground and says, "My Lord, my God." And Jesus says, "Here, touch me," right? I don't think the story says, then Jesus grabbed Thomas's finger and folding back the skin, inserted the finger into the skin. Like, here we have three curious disciples all touching Christ. I mean, he pushes it way over the top and makes it kind of gross. Again, from a guy who would have understood a knife wound from a street fight. It turns your stomach. Extremely strong, dynamic, in-your-face painting. Now, Caravaggio eventually got in some trouble. He was the most sought-after revolutionary rock star of a painter. I mean, he was painting in this incredibly bold new way, super powerful paintings. He could have all the commissions that he wanted, but he was also partying and getting into drunken bar brawls and organized crime. And, he was a younger guy in his 30s, but just not late 20s and 30s, but he had this party lifestyle, very much like your modern day rock star. So eventually he gets into trouble. And this is a painting he made around that time called The Death of Mary. You can see here, this is not recorded in scripture, but, according to tradition, Mary, the mother of Jesus, definitely passed away eventually. So you can see the followers all crying there. She's just passed away. There was a rumor going around, it's never been proven, but that in order to have a model for the particular piece, that Caravaggio purchased the corpse of a unclaimed corpse of a woman who had drowned in the river Tiber, and used her for the model of the Virgin Mary. That may have been a rumor circulated by one of his artistic rivals in order to defame him a little bit and bring him back down to earth. There's no evidence it happened, but there is a record that, of course, people knew that was the rumor that was being circulated. In any case, there were some rivals of his, in particular an artist named Tommaso. And the two of them, after a tennis match, and I have no idea what Baroque tennis looked like. My guess is that it's pretty different from modern tennis, but they challenged each other to a duel at night in the back alley streets of Rome, Baroque Rome. They fought with swords, and Caravaggio won. He stabbed Tommaso. Tommaso bleeds out and dies there in the street, and Caravaggio runs, and he goes on the run. So now he is not only the most sought-after revolutionary painter in the world, but he's also a wanted murderer. And so he flees to the south. He flees south to Naples, which is a couple hundred miles to the south. There's no unified Italy at this time, so Rome is its own city with its own army. Naples is its own territory with its own army, its own walls. Anyway, so he goes there. He paints there for a couple of years. He goes to the island of Malta as well, which is where this painting is. And his work, as if it could possibly turn darker, turns even darker in this time. He knows he's most likely fearful for his own soul. He knows he's killed a man. He knows he's made some enormous mistakes. Of course, there's a lot of guilt and a lot of holdover from late medieval attitudes about the church and about staying on the straight and narrow, and he's probably fearful for his own soul. And so subject matters take a deeper turn as well. So this is the execution of John the Baptist. John the Baptist in Scripture is arrested and beheaded. And so here we have, it looks like a prison yard scene, and you can see two prisoners craning their heads to look outside the bars there to see what's happening as the executioner is getting ready to remove his head and place it into this platter. It's a super dark, disturbing, difficult image to begin with, and Caravaggio, is fearful for his own head. And so it's a movie screen-sized painting as well, just absolutely enormous. Most of his are not this big. Mostly dark. Look at the whole upper half of the piece is mainly black and brown, dingy, dark. It looks like actors on a stage with a spotlight. One of the weird things about this picture, if you look at the bottom there, you can see John the Baptist's head and the blood spurting out onto the ground. Here's a detail of the blood. So he writes his own name. Remember, his name was Michelangelo Merisi. He kind of signs his name in the blood splatter on the ground, almost as if he knows, his time is coming. Then an amazing thing happens for Caravaggio. Caravaggio winds up getting a letter from, of all people, Borghese, the same cardinal, I showed you his bust earlier, who worked with Bernini. And he basically says, we've tracked you down, we know where you are, we know you've made some mistakes. We are willing, on behalf of God, behalf of the church, to pardon you completely if you will come and live at the Vatican and give the rest of your life to painting, using your enormous gifts to create works for the church. So here Caravaggio has a get-out-of-jail-free card. And so he prepares to sail back to Rome, packs up all of his things. He makes this painting right here and sends it ahead to Borghese as a thank you. It's his last picture. This is David and Goliath. So here we are looking at David again. David holds a sword there. He's just cut off the giant's head. Take a wild guess at whose portrait is the severed head of Goliath. That is Caravaggio, who's painted his self-portrait as the severed head of Goliath. And he sends this forward to Borghese and says, I will be there next month and prepared to work for the church. He never makes it. He tries to board a boat to go, and he gets recognized by people who know that he's a wanted murderer. He gets thrown into prison. He gets beat up pretty bad. He escapes from prison and attempts to walk to Rome. And halfway in between Rome, that's where he's found, his body washed up on a beach. And there's great mystery about what actually happened to him. If he just got sick and died trying to walk 200 miles through a malaria-infested coastline, or if he, his enemies caught up to him and, returned the favor for killing a rival artist. Nobody really knows, and that's part of the mystery of Caravaggio. What is known for sure, and you can see it through his paintings, is that they are some of the most in-your-face, fascinating paintings to have ever been painted. If you ever get the chance, the privilege to see one in person, which you can see certainly in Rome, they're all over the place, but also in places like Florence and the museum, and in museums around the world. They really do, compared to other paintings, they are a gut punch. They're sometimes difficult to look at, but they have an undeniable power that most other paintings don't. And a lot of it stems from this incredible use of light, dynamic use of light that Caravaggio pioneered, called chiaroscuro. So there you go. That's Baroque artists for today. Next time we'll talk about some others, Bernini and Caravaggio. Thanks for paying attention, and we'll see you next time.